Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Rosling Rönnlund, and I'm so happy to get the chance to talk to all of you. I have so many things I want to show, so let's get started immediately. First, I need to share my screen with you so that you can follow along. 1 second. Yes, just like that. So I will start by saying actually that my brother Thomas, he moved to Tokyo a few years back. So we're going to Tokyo as often as we can, and I think it's the most amazing place on earth, and I can't wait to get back the next time. So I come from the Gapminder Foundation. My name is Anna Rosling Rönnlund, and Gapminder Foundation, that is a small nonprofit based in Stockholm, Sweden, trying to promote a fact-based worldview that everyone can understand. And the foundation was started about 20 years ago by me, my husband Ola, and my father-in-law Hans. Unfortunately, Hans passed away some years ago, but me and Ola, we continue the work moving forward. So when we think about the world we live in, it can feel pretty scary, right? We have the wars going on, pretty scary things, right? We do have economic crisis in different cases and inflation and stuff like that. We do have the climate crisis and we do have the pandemic, right? And actually, all of these things, what they have in common is that we cannot combat them country by country or person by person. We need to collaborate because they won't stay within country borders. And therefore, we need to understand the world we live in so that we can know what are the most important things we need to do. So, when you see all these kinds of pictures, you get a pretty gloomy idea about the world we live in, right? I actually Googled the word hopelessness because I was interested in how Google would actually pronounce it. So listen now, I think it's pretty interesting.
Hopelessness.
Hopelessness. I mean, even when the AI is saying the word in English, it's saying it in a way that sounds pretty depressed, right? So I do think we live in a time when a lot of us are feeling very scared about the future and what's going on, right? And when we think about the future, it's very easy, feels like a very gloomy place like this. And what will we find in the future? Is there something optimistic happening? Maybe the future is this gloomy, but it could as well be like this, right? So I asked you what you thought about the world in 50 years, and here is the result. When you thought about the world, the majority of you thought the world would be worse or at least stay the same. Very few of you thought that the world would become better in the coming 50 years. When I asked about Asia, you were much more positive. But when I asked about Japan, as you can see, you have a pretty gloomy idea about the future of Japan. So, what we have done at Gapminder Foundation is that we have been going through a lot of official data and trying to see what the data says about the state of the world. And then we have also been looking at how people perceive the world and compared these two. And there is actually a huge gap between what the data says about the world and how people perceive it. So let's keep on moving forward. Quite often, when it comes to numbers, people are getting pretty afraid, right? We feel that it's boring and scary and it's hard to dive in. But what we've done as a Gapminder Foundation, we've spent the past 20 years trying to make sense of the data and make it visible and easier to understand. We've been developing different tools and we have been collaborating with the big data producers like the World Bank and the United Nations. We also been at Google. And what we tried to achieve was actually not only making the data from big data producers easier to understand, but also to mix them and make it easier to find the data when you search at Google. So what we found when we went through all Google search logs was actually that quite a few of the data of the public statistics that we were working on, people were actually searching for. But there was one word actually, and that was life expectancy. There was some kind of a search volume for life expectancy, but unfortunately, it was only in combination with one other word, namely cat. So it was a pretty depressing moment for us at that point, because we realized that people are not really that interested in the state of the world and global trends and proportions. Rather, they wanted to know whether their cat would live or die. So we decided to tackle the problem of making the world easier to understand in some other ways. First, we wrote the book FACTFULNESS that became an international bestseller. And in the book, we start by asking 13 fact questions about the state of the world to people in different countries. And since then, since the book came out, we have been searching all different kinds of data and been asking 10,000 fact questions actually about every single topic there is at the UN, more or less, trying to figure out what areas are people mostly wrong about. And from all these questions, I handpicked 12 questions that you got the chance to answer in a small quiz. So here we will find your results. This is what it looked like. So on these 12 questions, what you see is the green bars. That is how many percent of you scored correct on these questions. So as you can see, you are in the pretty low area, and the average correct results on all these questions for all of you was 21% correct. So most of the questions you actually got wrong. We will look at a few of them so you get an idea what they are all about. Here's one of the questions. In 1990, 58% of the world population lived in a low-income country. What is the share today? Is it around 9%, around 37%, or around 61%? As you can see, it's a huge difference between these three alternatives. 9 is the correct one, but very few people think that. So look here. Here is how people in different countries have answered this question. As you can see, the amount of green, namely being correct on the question, is a very, very small percentage. Let's play this and see what all the countries did. As you can see, almost no country got this correct. And of those countries that were most correct, there were no European countries, as you can see. The best scorers was China, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia in this test. So let's look at your result. I will compare your result with some other country data here. We have Germany, US, Australia, Japan, and now comes your result. Do you think you scored better or worse than the others? You actually scored a little bit better. But as you can see, you are also, just like everyone else we have been talking to, quite wrong about this actually. This is something people haven't realized, that the world has changed to the better when it comes to low and high income countries. So let's have a look. Here we can see all the countries in the world. Every bubble is a country, the color is the region, and the size is the population. On the one axis, you have child mortality, and on the other, income. So basically, in the upper left corner, you get many children and you have little money. And let's see what has happened over time. When this chart is all about, here we see the country colors, the population, and these two big bubbles, they are China and India. But this was actually what the world looked like back in 1950. Since then, a lot of things has happened. So let's see what happened. Here, all these countries were defined as developing countries. That was how you talked about the world at that point. Here you could find 90% of the world population back in year 1950. But things have changed. Have a look now. Here we play over time. As you can see, Child mortality is lowering, it's going down, 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 and people are getting richer and richer, right? So we can see how we're gradually moving towards the richer end of the chart with fewer children dying. And this is year 1990, and that was the year the question started asking about, the starting value. And that was the point where 58% lived in low-income countries. But of course, things has happened even since then. Let's continue playing. Now you will see how the world continues to change. China and India leaving the low-income segment and moving towards a richer end of the chart, right? So what we see now is actually only 9% of the world population now lives in this low-income country corner. The world has changed dramatically to the better when it comes to health and wealth. Most people today, they live in the middle-income countries, and we have a few, like you and me, living in high-income countries. So another question I asked you was, in which countries are people on average least satisfied with their lives? Is it in low-income countries, middle-income countries, or high-income countries? Low-income countries is the correct answer, but as you might guess now, most people get this wrong too. So here we see the results from the population in India, Japan. This is interesting. When we start asking expert audiences in different countries and in conferences and so on, we usually get much worse results than what the general public is scoring. So look here, this is bankers in the US. And now government in the UK, we ask some politicians, and as you can see, they score much worse than the general public. And here we have your result. 20% of you scored correct on this question. So Dollar Street is one project that we have been working on, trying to show what the world looks like at different income levels. Here we look at toothbrushing. We start brushing teeth in the richer end of the chart, moving slightly towards the left to poorer and poorer homes. As you can see, these are people in all different kinds of countries, but they are doing the same activity, brushing their teeth, because that is something all of us are doing everywhere. It's a basic function, right? But when we come to this end, the poorest end of the street, which is to the left, then people cannot afford plastic toothbrushes anymore. So they have to brush their teeth using either mud or something else, right? And the finger or a stick. So if you live in the poorest end of the Dollar Street, then you might need to use your fingers or stick to brush your teeth. In the middle-income countries, in the middle-income homes, you will have access to a plastic toothbrush, and in richer homes, you will have one toothbrush each, and you will have all these specialties, special things for caveats and special things like different toothbrushes, different toothpastes, and so on for different people in the family. So we can look at income distribution. So of course, within a country, there's a huge difference between the poorest and the richest. Here we see the US. It's the US ordered by income, so it's more like a mountain. So most people live in the middle, and then you have a few poor people to the left and a few rich to the right. And what we have done, we have been visiting homes all over the world on different income levels. So here we visited the Howards. We have visited Hadley's, a poorer family in the US, and we can go and look what life looks like on different income levels. So within US, we immediately see how big effect different incomes have on your cutlery drawer. Or we add another family in the middle, and now we can look at other things. We can look at the kitchen sink, we can look at the living room, and as you saw, huge differences within countries on different income levels. We've done the same in China, 3 homes, different income levels, and we can look at the sofas, we can look at the house structure, we can look at how you cook food on different income levels. But the cool thing, I think, is when we start looking at the same income level in different countries. What does it look like? So we go back to the two families, one in China and one in the US, that we already met, the Wus and the Howards. And look at their bedrooms. They look pretty much the same, right? They have the same type of brown leather sofa, and they have a similar play structure outside of their house. Of course, it's made in China, most likely in both cases. But as you can see, the similarities are quite big. And we can do the same in the other end of the street as well. So here we visit two homes, one in Nigeria and one in China. These families doesn't look to have much in common, right? But when we start looking at what they own and how they organize their everyday life, we see a lot of similarities. They have similar roof, similar sofas. They store their rice and grain in the same way. Both families are having fish for dinner, and they are boiling their water in identical ways. So Dollar Street, that project is one of the projects we've been working on at Gapminder, tries to break down the cultural stereotypes that we usually have about people in other places, and instead look at what everyday life is like on the same income level. And what you see then is on same income level, life is pretty similar no matter where you are in the world. But on different income levels, life is pretty different, right? So we can also look at happiness in this way. Here we see a chart with all the countries again, with happiness, different levels of happiness against income. And let's play it over time. As you can see, it keeps changing pretty dramatically. But when we look at it, we can see there's a huge difference in happiness levels on the same income level. So among the low income countries, the difference is huge between Mozambique, who is the least, between Mozambique, the happiest of the poor countries, compared to Afghanistan, the least happy country of the poor countries. But look here, of the poor countries, Mozambique is the richest. Of the poor countries, we can see here Mozambique is the happiest, but it's not as happy as any of the countries in the high income group. So let's look here. We can see Japan, and we can, on almost same income level, we can compare it with Finland. I need to move the window, I guess, like this. As you can see here, it's a huge difference on the same income level. So because of some different variations, we are not having the same experience, even though we are on the same income level. So life is different from the poorest to the richest. And it's a huge difference if you have to go to using the bush or field as a toilet, or if you can have a water closet. And if you have to eat the same porridge for every meal, or if you can change and eat with more varied ingredients and more tasty and more herbs and so on. So if we look at the results that you got, you actually had 12 questions to answer. And I started by asking you, before you saw your results, I asked you, how many correct answers do you think you will get on this quiz? And you could score from 0 all the way to 12, right? And this was your guess. So basically, you were guessing your average was somewhere around 5, thinking that you were like humble and looked at the overall results and thinking, I'm not so good maybe on all these global indicators, so probably I will get around half right on this, okay? Then I compare this with your actual results, and then we see a different picture. This is what you actually got on the question. And as you can see, there is a discrepancy. So quite often we are overconfident about what we know about the world we live in. And this is something we see over and over again, that we are quite wrong actually about the world we live in. And this goes for me as well, because it seems to be no matter if we're highly educated or low educated, if we live in Europe or if we live in Asia, it seems like we are sharing the same kinds of problems understanding the world we live in. And it doesn't seem to matter so much what political views we have either, because the differences are not that big. And it doesn't seem to matter so much what age we have either. So I think it's pretty interesting. We have a deluded worldview, and we should probably try to do something about it. And the good part here is, as soon as we understand that we are probably wrong, it's quite easy to fix, right? So the results you got, if we would have asked a chimp instead, it would be A, B, and C. Every question was an A, B, C question. The chimp would just pick one of those, right? And this is what the chimp would get. So as you can see, we have a room for improvement. So looking at your results, this was your average score. The chimp, would have ended up here. And we also asked a lot of these questions to some chatbots, and they are changing pretty rapidly, but usually they end up somewhere around here when we combine the results from several different chatbots on these questions. So as you can see, we should probably try to figure out how we can upgrade the worldview we currently have. Because this picture is a little bit sad, right? That we are in the third place when it comes to understanding the world we live in, even though we are the ones who are capable of dreaming and inventing and exploring, and we have empathy and we have visions and morals. So most likely we need to figure out a way of collaborating with the chatbots, the language models, to help us actually organize the knowledge in a better way that our brains can deal with. So when we've been testing these 10,000 questions, we have found that overall, most people are actually very wrong about the world they live in, about the global trends and proportions. They are systematically wrong in about the same way. They have stereotypes about people in other countries and other cultures. When it comes to questions about human progress, what we see there is that people are quite often underestimating what has happened, while when we ask questions about advanced technology, quite often they overestimate how far we have come. So why are we wrong about the world we live in then? Well, we learn in school what the world is like, but unfortunately, the knowledge gets outdated, right? And when we look out the window or talk to friends and family, it's too narrow. It doesn't really help us to see what the world is like because the world is so big. So most of us, we turn to the news because that's where we can get reports about current events happening. And we get to see a lot of things happening, right? But the problem is that it gets too dramatic. Even if the news excerpts are correct, the worldview we end up with is very, very doomsday. So here is an example what it could look like. This is like a parody clip, but I do think it's pretty good at showing how we are seeing these kinds of news all the time. We'll just listen for a little bit of the start.
Breaking news, everything is bad. It's just as terrible as you imagined and probably worse. With more, we go to Tom Lee Cruz. Tom Lee.
We're all in danger, Dan Lee.
Jesus Christ, what can we do?
Absolutely nothing.
It was good knowing you, Tom Lee.
I can't say the same.
That was unnecessary. We're just now getting in reports that all the children have exploded. They will be missed. Let's check in with Olivia Lee Rodrigo. Olivia Lee, where are you?
That's none of your business.
Yeah.
Breaking news.
As you could see, I think it gives a pretty good picture about what news are like, right? And what happens is that we get only a few of the things happening that will sort of pass a news filter and hit our brain. And when they add up in our brain, we get a very, very dramatic worldview. So here's an example of that. Here we see the causes of deaths in the US in year 2016. And we start by looking at how New York Times reported about the people dying in US that year. So this is of the coverage in the newspaper, 31% was about diseases and accidents. You had 11% about suicide, then you had homicide, but most of the coverage was about people who had died from terror acts. If we instead look at the data, what people actually died from that year, we will get a completely different picture. Of course, most died from diseases and accidents. There was a few suicides, there were some homicides, and it was almost no one dying. I have to move this again. There was almost no one dying from terror, because that's very uncommon. But as you can see in the news coverage, it took a huge part. So most likely, even if the reports we get from news are correct, they still delude our worldview because the proportions are skewed. So we wanted to understand how people see the world. So we started a project that we called the Gapminder Index. What we did was that we went to 3 countries, the UK, Japan, and Brazil. And we asked the general public what they thought about the levels of vaccination, schooling, and electricity of all other countries, every single country. And we combined that into an index, and this is what it looks like. Here you can see that everything that is yellow here, those countries are pretty correctly understood. The development level is quite accurate. But everything purple you see, in those countries, the development is really, really underestimated. And as you can see here, North America, most of Europe, Japan, Korea, and South Korea, and Australia, New Zealand, they are yellow, but everything else is more or less dark purple to light purple. And we can look at it in another way. So let's have a look here. This is the same data, and this is the actual data now for the progress of the countries. Every bubble is a country, and the size is the population. This is what the data actually is. But now we will see how people perceive these countries. We have Japan here on the top, and this is how the world is being perceived. As you can see, there is a huge gap between the real data and the perceived view of the world we live in, where we underestimate the progress in most countries. Japan here, this is how the difference between the real data and the perceived level. As you can see, Japan is slightly misunderstood, but we can look at a country like Chile being on the same level as Japan, but see the difference. It's huge between how it's being perceived and what the actual data says. And this was actually one other question I asked you, and only 15% of you was correct on this one, because most of you perceived Chile being a middle or a low income country, but it has been a high income country for the last 10 years. But very few people are aware about that, because we tend to get stuck on a worldview that is more negative than the actual data. So a country like Senegal, it's in Africa, it's also highly misunderstood. As you can see, it's perceived to have almost no progress, and it has a much better situation than what the data is looking like in people's heads, right? So when we try to do global collaborations, I think this has a huge impact on how we organize our collaborations and how we dare to travel and plan for work and so on. If we think that most countries are so underdeveloped, then we will most likely not start collaborations and so on that maybe might have been perfect if we had a better understanding about the actual development level. We can also look in the richer end, what countries are mostly misunderstood among the rich ones. And here are they. It's mostly like these oil countries. So when we think about the world, actually, most of the things we hear are bad things happening, right? But there are a lot of things that has improved. And here we're looking at the red charts are bad things decreasing over time, and the green are good things increasing over time. And we will have a brief look at some of those. They never make it to the news. They just think it's worth having a glance on them, reminding us that there are good things happening as well over time. People can read and write the majority of the world population today, and that used to be a rare thing back in the year 1800. We have more movies to choose from. It was pretty bad going to the movies in 1906. Pretty boring, right? If you don't like the movie. We have more science articles being published, so the research is increased quite a lot, which is most likely a really good thing, right? And we have a bigger portion of Earth being protected land, which is good. Then solar panels, they had become so much cheaper. Oil tankers doesn't spill as much oil anymore, and fewer children are dying, which is probably the most amazing data of them all. Back in year 1800, if you got a child, it was like 50% chance that that child would die before the age of 5, which is every parent's nightmare. While in year 2022, it's down to 4%, which is amazing. It's still sad that kids are dying, but it's much better proportions than it used to be back in the year 1800. If we look at where people live in the world, these spikes show where the population density are the biggest. But as you can see, can be quite hard to remember a picture like this. So we have simplified it. And instead, we can look at the world like this. We have 4 different regions, we have 8 billion people, and this is where they live. 1 billion in America, 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, and the rest end up here in Asia. So this is what the world looks like right now. But what will happen in the future? So 1115 is the PIN code of the world today. In the future, there will be more people in Africa. 3 more billions will come there, and it will not be a big difference in any other place, right? So if we divide the world into like the classical West, we will in the year 2080, this portion will only consist of 8% of the world population. The majority will, of course, be here. And living in Europe, quite often we hear people tend to think so much about the West, thinking that that is the center of attention, center of decision, and center of everything, right? But what we might in the West might call the rest, I mean, that should be changed to be called the world, because the West is just such a tiny, tiny little fraction of the world population. So I think we need to start behaving so we can create a better world together. We can look at the world like this. Here we have the world population again, and we can divide it into 4 different income groups. And this is what it looks like, roughly. The majority, as we've seen before, they live somewhere in the middle. And to understand what this means, we can look at how you transport things and people at different income levels. If you live on level 1, which is like extreme poverty, 10% of the world population live under these circumstances about, Then, if you want to go somewhere, you will have to walk. Next income level, then you will have access to a bike. Income level after that, then it will start to become a motorbike. And up here in the high income corner, there we will have access to a car in one way or another. We can break down the income figures into smaller units and see the world like this. And we can see that the typical human being of today live on the bike level in Asia, right? If current trends continue, then in 2040, it will look more like this. The population will grow, we will have more people from Africa, and we will have the majority of the world population have moved toward the richer end. So they left the level 2 and they're now moving to level 3. And thinking about the world in the future, it's very easy to think that everyone will move into big cities, mega cities like Tokyo. But actually, in year 2035, it's only 9% of the world population, more or less, that is expected to live in cities like Tokyo. Most people, they will move from rural areas into more like urban, like villages or small cities. This is the exception with these huge megacities. They will continue. There will be some more coming up, but it will still be the exception. If we look at what has happened to Japan over time, we can have a look at follow Japan's trend from back in year 1800. Here we see all the countries again, size, population, color by region, and we can see all countries back in the year 1800. They were down in this corner where you lived short lives and had little money, right? And if we now play it over time, we can see what has happened. Not much in the beginning. Japan is pretty steadily moving slowly here, also because it's a little bit lack of data, right? But now we can see things starting to happen. A First World War, here comes the Second World War, and then it's a steady improvement. We can follow. It's not going as fast anymore, but still, if we compare to the starting point, a huge success has happened. Now we continue with forecasts into the future, what is most likely going to happen more or less. And if we have a look now, we can see Japan started with a life expectancy around 36. When you were born, you could expect to become 36 years old back in year 1800 in Japan. And then time changed and you are now up at 85.3, which is an improvement of almost 50 years. Pretty impressive, right? And if we move forward into the future, it is supposed to continue, and the life expectancy will most likely end up somewhere around 95. Pretty cool numbers, isn't it? We can also have a look at the population because you might, as you saw, the world population keeps improving quite rapidly, but you have probably also heard that Japan's population is decreasing. So this is what it looks like. I have picked 4 countries for a selection from different regions of the world. We have Japan, we have Germany, Nigeria, and Brazil. Let's play them over time from year 1800. Here we can see how the population is pretty steady among these countries. And then here, just after year 1900, you can see Germany, Japan, they are moving a little bit away from the others. But now things are starting to happen. Look at Brazil, how it comes. And now Nigeria is catching up very rapidly. And this is today. Now the future. This is what is expected of the future. As you can see, Nigeria will have a super fast improved population. It will increase rapidly and a lot. While you can see, just as you know, Brazil and Japan will decrease its population size, while Germany will stay more or less the same. We can have a look at it this way as well. So we also can capture the age of people. So here is the age pyramids of the same countries and what the countries looked like back in year 1950. This is the typical shape of a population pyramid, right? Now let's play it over time from year 1950 and forward. As you can see, population now starts to increase quite a lot in Nigeria, and this is where we are expected to be in year 2100. The population in Nigeria will be much, much bigger because it's a lot of kids being born at this moment, while you can see countries like Japan and Brazil and Germany are flattening off and getting fewer kids than they have, like middle-aged and old people. We can zoom into focusing on Japan. Let's go back, sorry. This is Japan back in 1950 and forward into the future, just so you get an idea. If we look at it, you saw it was a pretty big change, right? So back in the year 1950, only 5% of the population in Japan was old, considered old people, right? Then a lot changed over time. Today, it's about 30% of the population. And by year 2100, it's supposed to be around 40%. So it's going to be quite a lot of old people now, from now on and into the future. And of course, one of the biggest reasons for that is how many babies each family gets. And if you get below 2.1 kids per family, the population will start to decrease. And this is what the world looked like 100 years ago. Families were big, women were getting quite a lot of kids, and then we can see what has happened over 100 years. We can see how babies per woman are decreasing quite a lot. And we see that Japan has now been in this population decrease box for quite a while. So back 100 years ago, a woman in Japan got around 5 kids during her lifetime, while now it's down at 1.15. The world average is around 2.2, and 2.1 is considered the rate where you need to be above 2.1 for not losing the population size. So when we talk about Japan, you can say that it has moved from being a country with a lot of kids to being a country with a lot of adults. And sometimes it's called the silver market. So it's a huge change from what it used to look like to what it is today. And Japan might be the country leading this development, but a lot of countries, when they are getting to the same income place as Japan, they are making a similar travel. So it's a very common thing that the stable, mature countries, women start having less children. And this might be worth looking at. This is a chart talking about if countries have laws against sexual harassment at work. And it's only using yes and no. And back in 1970, you could see that almost no country had any regulations to help people stay away from sexual harassment at work. But as time moves by, more and more countries are actually getting different kinds of laws to protect against sexual harassment. But as you can see, Japan have not done that yet. If we look at how many women are in parliament in Japan, we can see back in 1945, it was less than 10%. And as time goes, we see how it stays somewhere around that. Now it's getting up a little bit. It's moving upwards, but it's still 14.3%, while a country on the same income level like New Zealand has a completely different picture. So I'm not sure if these have any if those indicators are part of explaining anything while we are seeing so few kids being born, but I think it was interesting to have a look at. Also, we know that if we look at paid jobs, there is an idea that nowadays women are really being part of the workforce and that it's improving. But as you can see, women are on a flat level. It's more women in real numbers, but if you look at the percentage of the working people, women are on the same level as they have been since year 1990 globally. But if we look at the unpaid work, we see a big difference. So maybe this is something to work on as well, that as long as women are doing so much of the unpaid work, maybe they are not feeling like adding on the work with kids and sort of having a hard time being connected with the workforce. I'm not sure if that is what's going on, but I think it's interesting, and most likely it's part of the explanation. So the world keeps changing, it keeps growing, and when it does, there will be more things that needs to be built. We will need much more machinery and inventions to actually make sure that all the people that are coming in the coming years will get decent lives, right? So if we look at the use of materials globally, we can see that that has increased quite a lot over time. And if we look here, we can see there has been a huge improvement since year 2000. So, of course, everyone are not using the same amount of materials. So if we break that down on the world population, we will see that the richest, they use the majority of these materials, right? So it's quite easy to think that the rich are starting to use more and more and more and more material per person over time. But to understand why the material use is increasing, it's important to remember that the world population, which is the mountain in the back, it used to be like this, that the majority of the world population lived in the poorer end where they are using quite little material. But we will now play this over time, and you will see how the world population is changing and how it's ending up on more material use rich parts, so to say. Let's go. Here you can see how the world population is increasing, and understandably, if you have more people living on income levels where they consume more materials will be used. And in the future, most likely this will happen. Even more people using even more materials. If we look at the known reserves, we look at gas and oil, then we can see how they have changed over time. We have found more gas and more oil since the year 1980. So that also keeps increasing. And if we look at the research and development that is happening, we can look at the fuel production companies. They spend around 0.3% of their money on doing research for the future. If you look at electronics and pharmaceutical companies, they spend 12%. So the difference is 40 times between these two groups. And if we are going to change from depending on the fossil fuels, then we need to add more research in this industry as well, I would guess. So to understand the world, to make it super simplified, we often hear talk about sustainable development as a term. But if we think about it, sustainable, that is sort of, you can say, everything that goes with environment and climate and so on. And of course, there's a lot of things that is happening there that we can have a look at. And then we have development. That is more, we measure that more like child deaths. And children can die from so many different reasons, right? And to understand what's happening in the world, we can see of the children dying, most of them, they live in extreme poverty on the left end. Almost no kids are dying in the richer end of the chart. While if we look at CO2 emissions, we see the opposite image, where we see almost no CO2 being emitted for the poorest and quite a lot of for the richest. So if we combine these two images, what we see here is that to combat the biggest problems today, we need to look at the ends of the chart, right? So we need more sustainability for the richest, and we need more development for the poorest. That's how we need to tackle the biggest problems in the world today. So to understand the world, we do need to have data, we do need to use data, and we do need to understand the sort of frameworks and data sets of importance for global trends and proportions. But that is not enough, because we also need to find ways of outperforming random and the chimp. And the only thing I can think of is actually trying to figure out how we can use our brains more smartly. Because obviously, as I have been showing you before, is that our brains seem to collect information in a way that doesn't really represent what the data is saying about the world. So something has to be done. And we need to move away from seeing the world as like optical illusions, right? We need to see the world as it is so that we can make the best decisions moving forward. So therefore, we developed Factfulness rules of thumb. So basically, the book Factfulness is divided into 10 chapters, going through each and every one of them. I will run through them very briefly here, but you can go and check them out in the book if you want some context and a sort of better image. We can start by the different instincts that are ruling the way we think about the world. And the first one is the gap instinct. And we tend to think about the world as being divided. We tend to think about poor versus rich, like this, or good versus evil, and so on. We like when it's like conflict and two parts being far away from each other. While to understand what's going on in the world, we need to locate the majority, because most are in the middle, but usually we only talk about the extremes. So that is one point, one thing to remember. And the other thing is negativity. We do have an we do have an instinct to think negative and talk about negative things. I think most of you have been feeling or talking to friends and family and neighbors and so on. It's just getting worse. And we tend to talk to each other about things that are bad or getting worse, right? But would an improvement get publicity? Most likely not. We never see like headlines saying something like, yesterday all trains were in time again, because we always tend to focus on the bad stuff and we forget to communicate when good things are actually happening. Then we have the straight line instinct, that we tend to be driven by thinking about the world in a way that when we see a trend line like this, our brains fill it in, right? So it just continues. But it might be enough just remembering that many lines bend, many trends are looking different from the straight line trend. And maybe that little thought might help us to be more correct about the world. Then we have the fear instinct. We tend to be focusing on everything that makes us afraid. And instead, we need to remember to calculate the risks. We are usually afraid of spiders, but we forget being afraid for cars, right? Those kinds of proportions. Then we have the size instinct, that we tend to say it's a huge problem. Everything we talk about on global level will be huge, but we need to compare and divide to make sure that we can understand what's going on. So here is an example. Back in year 2020, 3,865,000 infants died in the world. Horrible number. But look, it used to be much worse. So what we need to remember is that even if something is bad, it can at the same time be better than it used to be. So it can be bad and better at the same time. But it seems like we humans have a very hard time keeping both those thoughts in our head at the same time. Then we have the generalization instinct. We tend to think that they are all the same, especially when it comes to people in other places or cultures and religions and so on, that we tend to group them very roughly, but quite often that can be a mistake. Here we see a group of refugees coming over the Mediterranean Ocean, heading for Europe, getting away from different hardships. And one of these boats with all these immigrants ended up accidentally on a nudist beach in Europe. And of course, these beaches with nude people are very, very rare. But think about the refugees on the beach. How long time will it take for them to realize that these nude men are exceptions, that most European men are not participating here? That will probably take quite a long time. Then we have the destiny instinct. It will always be like this. And we tend to think that countries and people and religions and so on are very stuck and will stay the same as they have always been. But we forget that if we look at the data, we can often see that there is a movement happening, but it's so slow, so we don't really see it without looking at the longer time series. Then we have the single solution, that very often when we have a solution, we want to apply it on everything. So if we're good at using a hammer, we want to apply it on every single problem, even though a toolkit would have been much better, and collaboration maybe. Then we love to blame. We love to find a scapegoat, but quite often it's not that easy. So to understand what's going on, as soon as we realize that we have a scapegoat, then we need to change and start thinking about the bigger, more complex problem to get a better understanding of what's going on. And finally, we have the urgency instinct. When we are upset and think something is bad, very often we want to do something big and we want to do it now. So we come to a state of mind which is now or never, but quite often we can make small steps. Take a small step, evaluate, a new small step, evaluate, more agile. And usually that's better, because when we make big decisions, when we are very emotional, that might actually affect how good those decisions are. So it's sort of just a set of thinking habits that we want to give to you, so that it becomes easier to see the trends and the data of the world and look at the news without continuing to feed this distorted worldview, and rather trying to build a fact-based worldview, which I think is very crucial for making the right decisions moving forward. So the good news here is that we come from a tradition where knowledge was stuck in libraries. Very few people had access, very few people could read and write, and it was hard to get your hands on the knowledge. But now we are actually moving away from that, and information is getting more and more democratized, and it's easier and easier to get access to information and knowledge. And that, I think, will have a huge impact on the way we can make decisions better over time. So if you should remember something from this lecture, it is that it's a huge gap between how we humans see the world we live in and what the data says about it. So it's very important that we change the way we approach the world we live in. So we want to get away from this and move to this, right? Because we humans, we can make so good decisions, and we can invent, and we can imagine things that have not happened yet. And since we have so many big challenges moving forward, wars, inflations, climate, and the pandemics and things like that, we really, really need to keep inventing, and we really need to keep collaborating over country borders. And to do that, we have to figure out how we can make use of the new technology so that it supports us, so we can get the most of our thinking for actually inventing what is not yet there at this point, because we want to dream up a future that is positive and good, that we can be proud of. And so to plan for the future, we do need to know the present. And I think you have seen now that quite often we are wrong about the present. And if we are wrong about the present, when we dream up the future, we have the wrong starting point, which might be very problematic. So I would suggest that you should start to be more humble, more curious, and have hope for the future. Because if we have hope, I think we dare to start working on the big problems and challenges we have ahead. Just remember how bad things used to be way back. And so gradually we have improved so many different areas. So why wouldn't we be able to do it with the problems we have today? So get the hope going and use the hope to start dreaming up a good future together. So if you should get a starting point, I could recommend actually reading Factfulness. It's pretty easy read, a light read, but you will get a lot of examples pretty similar to the ones you've seen here with global trends and so on. And thank you so much for spending time with me and listening to everything I try to run through. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to contact me in social media, or you can send an email to me directly at anna@gapminder.org. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to come to Tokyo as soon as possible again, because that is my favorite city of all cities. So thank you so much, and hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.